7 decades ago, the first television adaptation of Superman arrived. Now, it's time to rocket back to the 1952 to 1958 series Adventures of Superman, starring George Reeves. In this Rewatch podcast, my guests and I break down each episode, from its black and white crime drama beginnings to the kid-friendly color seasons, as we celebrate one of the most underrated Man of Steel depictions of all time. Welcome to another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Season 1, Episode 13, The Stolen Costume, is returning guest Dan Greenfield from 13th Dimension. Dan, welcome back.
Episode 13. I didn't even realize that. What a coincidence. I love it. Hi, Anthony. How are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you too. This is an episode I've certainly been looking forward to. I know you have as well. I imagine the audience has been excitedly anticipating this one too. Is it fair to say this is not only the most legendary episode of Season 1, but one of the most legendary of the entire series?
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, it has such a cult following. I almost feel like we should structure this podcast like a trial, the trial of Superman, because of not what happens in most of the episode, but what happens in the last 5 minutes, which is debated to this very day. And I have opinions, and I am sure you do too.
Yes, so I'm excited to get into it. And so you're actually our first returning guest on the podcast. So congratulations.
Wow. All right. I managed to schnur my way onto another episode, which I would love to schnur myself onto a third, which is the Evil 3. I figure if I mooch once and it worked, if I'll mooch again and maybe it'll work a second time or a third time. But
I don't mean to dash your hopes, but that one is spoken for.
No. Oh man, that one is so unhinged. Because the funny thing was, like after we had agreed to do this one, I kind of had second thoughts. I thought, I'd really like to kind of see Mystery in Wax, which is insane. But we stick with the Stolen Costume, and I can't complain because it's one of the greats. So thank you for having me.
No, of course. It was so much fun when you were on last time and we talked the monkey mystery, because
yes,
as you and I both said, I think while we were recording and then afterwards as well, it's like it ended up being so much more fun and we had so many more laughs than I was expecting to have about that episode in particular. It was such a blast. And one of the things that's cool about having a repeat guest is, of course, I always love to hear about each guest's history with the show. We always start with that. But an advantage with the returning guest, we can just launch right into the episode.
Right.
So I'll also say structure-wise, to your point, what I'm going to do, I'll lay out my tech specs like I normally do, who wrote it, who directed it, all of that. I'm going to give a little bit more of a detailed play-by-play in lieu of a 1 or 2 sentence synopsis. So I'm going to give a little bit more of a play-by-play, and then we're not locked into a strict scene-by-scene breakdown. We can jump around wherever we want. We can start at the end, whatever makes the most sense. So I think that will serve us well for this legendary 13th episode of the first season. So this aired December 12th, 1952, written by Ben Freeman, directed by Lee Sholem. So here is my play-by-play. A wanted rope burglar, T-Ball, evades capture by entering the open window of an apartment. Inadvertently pressing a concealed button, the burglar accesses a hidden closet containing the costume of Superman. He makes off with the costume, but is shot outside the building. Seeking shelter with gangsters Ace and Connie, he tells them about the costume and where he found it before dying. Initially skeptical that the costume is the real deal, Ace and Connie grow more intrigued when their efforts to burn and cut the costume prove fruitless. Meanwhile, Clark enlists the aid of private investigator Candy Myers, but refuses to tell Candy what was stolen. Connie identifies Clark Kent as the resident of the apartment in question, but mistakes Candy for Clark. Deciding to test their theory, Ace plants a bomb in the hidden closet, which Clark narrowly saves Candy from. Over the phone, Clark and Ace make plans to meet at Clark's apartment, but Candy intercepts Ace and Connie outside, posing as Clark. In his reporter garb, Clark races to Ace's place, saves Candy from a bullet, while also knocking Candy out cold, and decides to move Ace and Connie to a remote mountaintop cabin where they cannot tell anyone his secret. Despite Superman's warnings, Ace and Connie immediately try to climb down the mountain after Superman leaves, falling to their deaths, leaving a very relieved Clark to debrief Candy at the end. And that is our play-by-play of the Stolen Costume. Did I leave out anything?
No, that pretty much covers it. I guess we're done.
Adventures await. See you next time. No,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
but now we can
No. That.
unpack everything.
Yeah.
We can share our takes
Okay.
on all of it. So,
Sure.
where would you like to start?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting. The story itself has an interesting background in that it was based on a radio episode called "Dead Men Tell No Tales," which is a little bit more two-fisted than this version of it. It is an almost note for note. The script is almost note for note the same. There are some distinct differences, but really it's the same story involving Candy, the private detective, the fact that Superman slash Clark Kent are the only Daily Planet characters in the movie in the episode. It's basically a George Reeves showcase, but even he comparatively is not in it quite as much as he normally might be. There's a lot of time spent not only with Candy, but with the villains of the piece, who are played by Dan Seymour, who plays the gangster, and Vita Ann Borg, who plays the Mall, and both of whom were character actors of the day and appeared in major motion pictures. Dan Seymour, for example, was in a little movie you might have heard of called Casablanca. He was in a um, God, you just go down the list, but he was in also what was it? Well, Abbott and Costello in the Foreign Legion, which is always good. But he was also into Have and Have Not. Some people might confuse him with Victor Buono because there is a striking similarity. But he also was on the Batman '66 TV show playing the Maharaja of Nimpa, who was fond of golfing with, I think, golden crusted clubs, and then he gets bad things happen to him. And Vita Ann Borg was in a little movie called Mildred Pierce. So I mean, we're talking about characters who've been around, worked with real heavyweights, and they both really bring it here. I think she's terrific, especially as the Mall, because she's one who's really driving the story here. She's the one who's like convinced there's more to it than all of this. But on the whole, it's a fun little tight mystery. It has significant plot holes, as a lot of these episodes do, but I'm not going to dwell on them. And it's one of the most entertaining episodes, certainly of the series, let alone the first season.
Well said. And on the note of Dan Seymour, in addition to those credits you listed, he was also in an earlier episode of Adventures of Superman, episode
Yeah,
8, The Mind Machine, where he played Lou Kranick. So we have one of our bad guys coming back in a different role here.
and
I don't know.
I'm pretty sure. I'm sorry. I'm pretty sure he comes back again too. I mean,
Yes,
he pops up a lot. Is my recollection.
this might just be me, but I got, as you know, and I've mentioned this many times. I'm a huge Honeymooners fan, and watching the two of them, I felt a little bit of like a Ralph Cramden, not Alice vibe, but uh, Connie actually reminded me more of Trixie from the Honeymooners. And as I'm watching this,
I'll
and
buy that.
Dan Seymour again. I'm not saying it
Yeah,
reminded me exactly of Jackie Gleason, but there was just like a little bit of a hint of that, and
yeah.
the physical presence as well. But watching the two of them, especially with like when they were kind of working stuff out between the two of them, it made me feel like I was kind of in that Honeymooners vibe with Ralph, and again, not Alice but Trixie. That was kind of what I had in my head.
That's interesting, but I find that's the case with. I mean, it's different when you and I because of the way I'm wired, I have a tendency to compare things, particularly when they're relatively close together in time, compare it to Batman, which of course is a very different show and it had a very different approach. But what I really do like about, and the difference with Batman is that they had guest stars who were much bigger names than were on Superman. But these are hardcore, top-notch character actors who were in these episodes, and a lot of particularly in the first two seasons, the villains, the side characters, they bring it. I think there's a lot to be said for one thing. I mean, it's almost like a company because they do have some of the same actors coming back again and again and again. But it also, I think, really the two of them really work. But they're just Candy also is excellent. I love that guy, and it's like, where is Candy, and why isn't Candy still around? I mean, Candy was in the radio show, and he apparently was on more than once. Like he was kind of a recurring character. And I thought to myself, and I saw someone write this online also. It's like, what? How come Candide never made it to the comics? Really? I mean, maybe he did in an issue or two, but he would have been a great character to have in the comics. He's this really cynical but fun kind of wry private detective. He gives Clark the business throughout the episode because Clark is not helping him do his job. The whole idea that Superman's, you know, the guy rips off his uniform, and then Superman goes to Candy to tell him, but it won't tell him what it is. What did I'm missing something. Well, what is it? I can't tell you, but it's very important to me. And you kept it in a secret closet. Yes, but I can't tell you what it is. And it's definitely not Superman's costume. and and I just love Candy's entire. Candy rolls with it, but he's also like gets increasingly annoyed as the episode goes on. So he's great. So really, when you're talking the main character actors here, they deliver the episode as much as George Reeves.
I couldn't agree more with all of that. A few things I want to follow up on. So, you mentioned the radio episode. It was a half-hour episode, Dead Men Tell No Tales. Even earlier than that, there was a serial, The Mystery of the Stolen Costume, which hit a lot of the same beats, but was more involved and drawn out. And Batman and Robin were part of it as well. So
Yeah,
I didn't delve
which
into
I
that,
have to
but
listen to now. Yeah,
well, that's the thing. And I've said this before, but the radio show, even for everything that I've explored on this podcast and digging for kryptonite, the radio show still remains a pretty big gap for me. I've listened to a little
me
bit,
too.
but barely scratching the surface of thousands of episodes. But I did listen to Dead Men Tell No Tales, and yeah, it
Yeah,
was
me too.
fascinating to be able to compare them. They are very similar. A few interesting distinctions. For one thing, in the radio episode, the point is made via narration that it was a spare costume of
Yes,
Superman's that was stolen. Whereas here, it's the costume, and it was in his closet because Clark had a physical that day for the Daily
right.
Planet's insurance plan. uh,
I love when they would introduce the mundane shit about working in an office. I mean, I know we talked about that a lot of the time, but he even seems kind of annoyed by it. He's like, "Yeah, I had to show up for a physical, Clark Kent, a physical, because of some new group insurance plan." Which is great.
Well, that's as is often the case when we're watching and talking about these episodes. I'm always so curious about what's going on in between the scenes and before and after the episodes. Like, how did he get through his physical? You
Right.
know.
Well, I'll tell you how he got through his physical. They showed this in the comics. I don't remember how they explained away why the needle wouldn't go into his arm. I forget that, but they did explain why, because there was a story that explained how did Clark Kent get out of World War II? How was he not drafted and sent overseas? Because if there isn't a 1A candidate on the planet, in DC, it's Superman. But he was 4F because now I think they said he was inadvertent, but when they tested his eyesight, he had his X-ray vision on, and he read the eye chart in the next room. So they said, you don't have good enough eyesight to serve in the military. And so that was how he became 4F, which I thought was a really, really clever way of answering that question during wartime. Um, how would he pass a physical? Superman's got all sorts of tricks. I got to figure that by the time he was a grown man after Smallville and dealing with doctors, he must have had a way. Batman, you know what? Here's what I'm going to say happened. I'm going to say that his buddy Batman who's a master of disguise, set him up with one of those squibs on his arm, so that when they put in the needle, it drew out blood, and it was actually Bruce Wayne's blood. And so there you have it,
I
which is
like
also
a
probably very healthy blood.
yeah. I like
I'm
that, and
going with that.
I am familiar with that World War II story that you were talking about, and that
Yeah,
was a great one. In my mind, knowing this version of Clark Kent, the George Reeves tough, impatient Clark, I feel like they probably tried to stick him with the needle. It broke, and he's like, "What kind of defective needles do you have here? I don't have
right,
time for
right,
this," and
right.
he
You
just
can see
left.
that. Yeah, right, right. Look. Just check my eyesight. I got to run. I got a big
That's
story to cover.
that's my
I'll
headcanon.
tell that I'll buy both. Either one works. Let's say one is on Earth 1 and the other one's on Earth 2. Let's do that. Either one I think is qualifies.
But so talking about the costume itself, you mentioned before the plot holes, and I agree with you. It is what it is. We suspend our disbelief.
Yeah,
We
I'm
buy
not even
into it.
gonna.
But
Yeah,
it's interesting about whether it's the soul costume or the spare costume, because in the TV show, we have to buy into a couple of huge coincidences, right? That the rope burglar happens to enter Clark's apartment and is able to access the closet. And it's the exact day that this guy had a physical and was not wearing the costume that any other day he would be wearing. Whereas if it's a spare, it's like, okay, at least that's one piece of it. We don't have to, we don't have to necessarily buy into it. It's like, okay, that would always be hanging there.
but it's also first off, yes, the coincidence is it's just because why because the plot and but what I think it was a very very smart move to make it his main costume. And the reason is because of the visual gags that you didn't necessarily get on the radio, which is Superman because it's his only costume, presumably, or at least maybe he's got one hidden somewhere. I don't know. He can't turn into Superman. So they even play up visually with the gag where one time he's ready to run off and he opens up his tie and he's getting ready to and he realizes, oh wait, I can't. And it also adds to the drama of the climax when jumping ahead to when he actually finally confronts the bad guys. He has to burst into the room as Clark Kent, knock out Candy really quickly with a punch so Candy doesn't see what happens, and then it also does the same thing of actually confirming to the villains that he is Superman because he's wearing his Clark Kent outfit. It's not like he can say, "Hey, I'm Superman. I'm wearing my outfit." Whatever. He is caught, and by making it his main costume, that is really emphasized, and it really, I think, in a better way, sets up the, shall we say, controversial ending, which I want to save for a little bit because I think the ending in and of itself, it definitely deserves some people's court treatment.
No, I agree with you. Honestly, I do think that the the trade off between the coincidence and everything you laid out is worth it because I agree. It really does. It raises the stakes. It heightens everything, right? Because on the one hand,
You
yes,
actually see him, yeah, you actually see him running up the stairs in his Clark Kent outfit as opposed to flying in through the window, and so it adds that tension. Is he going to save Candy in time? It was a smart move. I don't know if it would have made any difference on the radio, but on television, it definitely made the difference. Being able to see that was key.
yeah, like you said, in that moment where he where he goes to rip open his shirt
I
and
love
realizes
that.
it's such a great thing. And then I always love. I appreciate the formula that we follow in most of these episodes, but I love anytime we can sort of mix it up a little bit. And seeing him
Yeah,
race into action dressed as Clark while the Superman music is playing, it's like,
hmm,
whoa, it's like this is different. This is its own thing.
yeah,
It's really, really cool.
yeah.
And yes, we both have now mentioned when he knocks out Candy. This is not the first time on Adventures of Superman where he needs to render someone unconscious, a friend, no less, to protect his secret. And he does not do it gently. I mean, he just clocks
He
him.
pops him. Yeah. It does. It's just like bam, and Candy's like right out, and it's no, it's great, and I will say this without, and I don't want to spend too much time in it. I do think that the episode lags a little bit in the middle when there's a lot of the back and forth between Candy and the villain and the villains and Ace and the girlfriend or whatever, and I don't even need to go too much into that. I find that it does slow the episode down, but the setup at the beginning and the payoff at the end, basically the first and third acts, I think are really what make this episode. Um, Other thing is how come Rope Burglar hasn't become a mainstay of the Superman Rogues Gallery? I mean, I know he died in this episode, but Rope Burglar, I mean, he apparently was really messing with Metropolis. I mean, when I mean, he's got a a 5 column, 2 deck banner headline on the cover of the Daily Planet, as if nothing else is going on in the Daily Planet other than rope burglar. And I'm like, and he's got two names. He's got rope burglar and T-ball. So he's got that going for him, which is nice. And no, I mean, don't you? I'm just surprised that nobody like Alan Moore has come back with Rope Man and like turned him into like a really like a bondage oriented like scumbag, because that seems to be crying out to be done. It's like bring sort of like how Tom King brought back Kite Man and just made him basically, you know, this strange character. So I think I want to start the Rope Man Club.
Listen,
I'll leave out the bondage part, but I definitely think that Rope Man could have been more.
everything seems to come back around. So to your
Yeah,
point, you never know. Also, you never know who's listening to these episodes because on digging for kryptonite, just a very quick tangent, but I've been preaching something about the Clark and Lex dynamic that I've wanted to see in the comics, and all of a sudden now I'm seeing it play out exactly as I had been outlining. And I was saying to myself, I'm like, Josh Williamson, Philip Kennedy Johnson, Tom Taylor, who knows? Maybe one of them listened. I'm not
I,
taking
you
credit. I'm
know,
just saying.
right. But I was going to say I've had that happen a number of times on 13th Dimension, where I say to myself, I'm not taking credit, but I'm kind of taking credit for this one, because I'll lay out something and say, wouldn't it be neat to see this? And then all of a sudden, a few months later, oh, isn't that interesting? Like there's a like I'm not even gonna get into one of them. It's like I found an artist on Facebook a few years ago, and he wonderful Batman drawings, very much in the style of David Mazzucchelli, very year one ish, and they were just striking images. And out of left field, I just decided to do a piece on them, and I said, the headline was, "Here's your next great Batman artist," and it was Jorge Fornes, and who within months, interestingly, was getting assigned Batman stories. Now, for all I know, the Batman art he was working on was already being done for that other I have no idea. But now he's become like one of Tom King's go-to artists, and he's highly thought of. And if he hasn't won an Eisner yet, I believe that he will. So I'm taking credit for his career, even if I really have no right to. So there's that.
I'm on board. Look, you never know what we can manifest through these
Never
podcasts.
know. I
So you never
know. It's
know.
true, man. Put
But
it out
speaking of
there.
with the rope burglar, so
Yeah.
this was mentioned. I watched the episode last night twice. Once with commentary by author and historian Gary Grossman, and obviously once without. And Grossman mentioned this in his commentary, but a previous episode guest, Rob O'Connor, who I had on when we did the rescue episode, he had actually mentioned it when we did that episode where that headline, that newspaper headline about the rope burglar, was used in that rescue episode when Clark is outside the DC office of the Daily Planet and like a stack of newspapers is thrown down. And the
Funny.
headline is the rope burglar. So that was a nice, it's funny because I assume we can attribute this to, hey, like we had this made and we're just going to use it again. And the way
Yeah.
they were shooting these episodes all together, in the batches that they did. But it's kind of cool. It's like, oh, when you watch them, it's like, oh, maybe this guy was operating, for so long, was, eluding the police. And now we get the payoff in this episode. It works in its
Right.
own way.
Yeah. Or they were shown out of order, and the paper that you saw was a back issue, because believe me, in a newsroom you see plenty of old newspapers lying around. So that's
That
plausible.
That too. In listening to that commentary, if there's anything as we're making our way that is relevant, I'll kind of drop it in. But the one other thing that Grossman spent a little decent amount of time talking about was smoking, the character smoking
Yeah.
in the episodes, and
Oh,
of
yeah.
course, sign of the times. But of course, they make the point that Clark will not partake. When Candy offers it to him, he's like, "No, I don't use them." Just like in an earlier episode where the Secret of Superman, where the doctor who's been drugging everyone trying to get information about Superman is offering Clark lunch, and he's like, "Do you want beer or wine?" And he's like, "Neither, milk or ginger ale only." It's a very
That's it. Milk. I love when they show them drinking milk, because even a grown man who doesn't drink alcohol is not really drinking milk. I mean, it's just such a funny thing. And that would happen on Batman also. No, thank you, citizens. A glass of cool milk will certainly do the trick. That sort of thing. And Yeah, no, I like that. And the smoking, of course. Well, throughout this entire series, everybody's smoking, especially in the first two seasons. But I also thought it was funny the way he said it. He's, I don't use them, which made me think like as opposed to saying, well, no, I don't smoke. I don't use them. And I thought, I wonder if that's just a one of those little turns of phrases that was used back then that just kind of vaporized, or maybe I'm overthinking it. But when he said that, he was like, I don't use them. So I don't think I would ever. If someone offered me a cigarette, I'd say no, thanks. I don't smoke.
Right.
But anyway,
No, it's a good. I've never that.
yeah,
I did
it
flag
just
that
was
too.
one
I've
of those
never heard
little
that.
things. Well, because I actually I don't want, I'm not going to make too much of it, but I do really like part of the, especially with these, less so on Batman, but more on the Superman, is that I really do enjoy the language, the vernacular of the time, the way things were phrased, the slang, a little, I that's part of the um, it's part of the experience of watching these episodes. And in this one in particular, it really has that. Smoking is, just a part of it. But if you're talking about the first two episodes, particularly the first episode, or I'm sorry, the first two seasons, especially the first season, this one has noir all over it. I mean, this is a noir episode. Even at the beginning with the shadowy, the way he breaks into Clark Kent's apartment, he finds by mistake the hidden closet, and then then he's shot in an alley while clutching Superman's costume, and he stumbles his way over to Ace's place, and Ace wants no part of it. It's like, why did you come here, man? I don't want some dead guy on my couch, which is a very big time mobster thing to say. Um, but yeah, it's that to me is part of the color of these episodes, color of these black and white episodes, I should say.
Yeah. No, well said. I mean, it really all contributes to just the overall atmosphere
Yeah,
and
the
vibe of
feel.
everything.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned Candy, and I echo what you said. I love the idea of this character, and this episode or this story itself, as we've seen it told a few times, right, is such a great vehicle for Candy because it's like Clark needs someone's help, but it's like who is he going to go to? And so it makes sense, and it creates such a fascinating dynamic in this episode where you get the tension between Clark and Candy. You see that there is this friendship there. We've never seen it on the show. This is Candy's only appearance on the show. But to your point, yes, he had a long history on the radio show. But
And they
here,
have
this
a
is
rapport,
right. And like that's the
instant
thing.
rapport.
Like we're in this kind of like lived in world. Like we know that there's some backstory there. So yes, there's this professional private investigator client relationship, but also friendship as well. So, but you get that tension between them where, like we were saying, I mean, it puts Candy in a really tough spot. I feel like Candy is kind of a saint in this episode because he really does a lot for someone who is not giving him the information that Candy really needs. And then you also get,
Is
I
his
think,
life in danger?
I love this setup where, and I feel like visually one scene that I think really captures it nicely is when Clark is on the phone with Ace, and Candy's behind him, and then Clark's on the phone with Ace, and it's like Clark is caught between these two people, like he's trying to obscure the truth, right, from both of them, one who has nefarious intentions and one who's trying to help him, and like Clark is stuck in the middle. It just puts him in such a tough spot. I love the setup of all of this.
I also imagine that the writers um, chose Candy as opposed to Perry, Jimmy, Inspector Henderson, or Lois. Maybe they decided to adapt this episode because the others weren't available at a time, or for budget reasons, they just wanted to save on salaries for an episode or whatever. So they went with, a Superman only episode. But it sort of makes sense that he goes to Candy, who is, as a private detective, is supposed to be defined by his professional discretion. He goes to Henderson. Henderson is not going to give up on what it is that's missing. He is not going to buy that. He's a cop. He's going to demand answers. And Lois, forget about it. This will send off all of her, you know, spider senses, to borrow a phrase. Jimmy, forget it, and Perry would have no patience. What do you mean? You know, which, by the way, John Hamilton, was in The Maltese Falcon. I'm just mentioning that as another great noir film. I happen to It happened because I was watching it recently, and he popped up on the screen, and I'm like, oh my god, Inspector Henderson is playing the DA in San Francisco. I digress. Um, but yeah, I do like the fact that it's Candy, even though you've never seen him before. It actually fits the plot.
Yeah, for sure. Like absolutely, it makes total sense. And yeah, to your point about this level of discretion, it's like whether it was born out of, like you said, production or budget limitations, it so works. In listening to the radio show, I feel like they amplify the tension even more in the radio
Yeah,
episode between Clark and Candy. Here, it was, it was a bit lighter, but you definitely got like Candy's frustration came through in Clark not telling him. As we're watching this, listening and watching, especially as we're watching the episode, I'm saying to myself, what does Candy think was in there? It's,
right, right. Did Candy ever get the notion that it was Superman's costume? I mean, that's also that actually goes to one of the great points of the episode overall, and one of my favorite scenes and conversations in the series is when Ace and I'm sorry, what is her name? Why am I
Connie.
drawing a blank? Thank you. Ace and Connie are discussing the concept of Superman's costume because Ace is completely skeptical about the whole thing. And she's like, well, wait a minute, hold on. This could actually be his costume because, sometimes he's the other guy. And he's like, what are you talking about, the other guy? She says, the other guy. Most people think that he's two guys. He's Superman, and then when he's not being Superman, he's the other guy. Now that's an interesting philosophical debate because when you think about it, that's one of the great questions about why anybody would think Clark Kent, other than the fact that he looks just like him. Why would anybody think that Clark Kent was Superman? Why would anybody think that Superman had a secret identity? What would be the need for? I mean, all he would really need to do is present himself as I am here, and then when I'm not here, I'm somewhere else. Maybe I'm on the other side of the world saving something there. Maybe I'm in my Arctic fortress, which never gets mentioned on this show. But I have theories, and I look at that and I think it's really fun to hear them put that whole concept right out there for the viewer. Is this idea, this assumption that Superman does have a secret identity, whereas really you could also argue that there would be no reason for people to believe that. So, which is also why he kind of plays into some people say, well, how come Clark Kent, who looks just like Superman, um, how do people not see through his disguise? And I think it was in Superman and American Alien, I think it was, where the question comes up. He says, the way he ends up answering the question is, yeah, I get that a lot. Does anybody ever say you look like Superman? Oh, yeah, I get that a lot. Which, that's a great answer. It really is a great answer, and it really dispenses with that trope, which of course is part of the Superman legend, but nevertheless. So I really like that scene. I really like the way she's kind of piecing it together, and eventually is able to persuade Ace that yeah, they might be onto something here. And he's like, and she actually does the legwork. She figures out that he's where Clark Kent lives. I mean, she's not giving up, so she does a lot of legwork, does what needs to be done, comes back to him. She more or less convinces him, but he wants his own proof. She's like, "What more proof do you want?" And he's like, I gotta check something out." And that's of course where we get to the ultimate. Let's go try to kidnap him or try to do whatever and actually confront him and see what happens. Of course, if they thought he was Superman, what did they really think they were going to get over on Clark Kent? Is the implication that because she says it didn't look like him, but maybe the suit makes him look different,
Right.
which they don't really follow up on, but it's worth it's no less a plausible explanation than anything else. For if you're an average person, maybe you think it's the suit that makes him Superman, and that when he puts the suit on, he looks different. That it's a magical suit, or because who knows? So it may at first it sounds kind of corny, but when you think about it, it's like okay, well that's as plausible as any other reason. If you're just a civilian, in Metropolis, you don't really know how it all works, so you can make assumptions. But nevertheless, when she puts it all together and he finally buys in, to me, that's when the episode really takes off. The last 5 to 10 minutes of this episode, or 5 to 8 minutes, or whatever, is where we get into an area that is controversial and incredibly fun to debate. In other words, did Superman commit murder? Which is what everybody wants to talk about after they've watched this episode.
Yes, and we won't delay that conversation much longer, but just a couple more
No.
points. I do want to say, I mean, I well said on all of that, and as far as what the costume might do, for example, that points to a discussion we had just a couple episodes ago when we did the Secret of Superman, because in that episode, again, that's the Doctor drugging the Daily Planet staff trying to get information on Superman, and when he drugs Lois, right, it's this truth serum, and he's questioning her, and the Doctor talks about how, oh, Superman is so compassionate, he looks out for the weak. Maybe he's a woman. Like for this moment, he suspects that it might be Lois. And though it's not explicitly articulated, there is maybe this idea that's being considered here that there is this again an element of magic or some form of transformation that's taking place. So yeah, it is fascinating to kind of get more of a sense of what the people of the city think. So I agree with all of that. I love how Connie moves everything forward because I agree. I think if not for Connie, especially when she's testing the costume itself, if not for that, I'm 99.9% sure that
Mm-hmm.
Ace would have had the costume tossed away along with T-Ball when that was all happening. So she does a lot. Kind of on the note of the costume, not to nitpick here, but it's interesting. So we know from Superman on Earth that Ma Kent, Sarah in this iteration, right?
I was waiting for this.
I gotcha. I was it was on the tip of my tongue to say Martha. I'm like, nope, not yet. But
Sarah.
she made him the costume. So, this sort of raises the question of if this material is so indestructible. And I know the comic stories have given us explanations for how they were able
Yeah,
to do all of this. But skipping ahead a bit to probably the most legendary episode of this entire series, Panic in the Sky, when
right.
Clark has lost his memory but he's wearing the costume. And there is a discussion in that episode about whether or not the costume, right, kind of gives him the powers or
Right. Yep.
has any effect. And the point is made of like, no, it's not the costume, it's Superman himself. I mean, again, this was an earlier season and, things changed, but I just kind of had that in my head when we were kind of looking at
Sure.
the indestructibility of all of this and how we could reconcile that.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the why, which is another question, is that why would Kryptonian fabric be indestructible? Um, that is never really. I mean, the explanation that Superman gives off an aura of protection because it's so close to his body, it's as good a reason as any. But really, the 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 pseudoscience behind why Superman has his powers makes it easier for me to believe than the idea that his costume cannot be damaged. And my recollection is that John Byrne did away with that. He did make it so that Superman's costume could be torn and it could be damaged, and it was just fabric. And but in that case, also his mother made the outfit, but she based it. I don't even know if he had a red and blue blanket. I don't know if they even dealt with that in Man of Steel. Anyway, point being is that there have been times when his costume is not indestructible.
One more question, and then we'll get into the murder trial. But this version of Clark, and it's always fascinating when we watch these George Reeves episodes and thinking about the larger context and mythology of the character. And certainly as a child of the 90s, reading the Triangle era, watching Lois and Clark, watching Smallville, it's always Clark is who he is, Superman is what he can do. The Clark identity is so important to him, and he has these personal relationships. Eventually, he has romance and marriage with Lois. His parents are alive. This version of the character in this episode, his costume is stolen, and it's his only costume, so he needs it back to be Superman. But there's also the identity aspect. But how worried or not do you think this Clark is at the notion that he might have to abandon this identity and get a new one? Like how much of a concern or a driver do you think that is for this particular version of the character?
Oh yeah, I mean he's so protective of it, and I mean the thing is he doesn't even really get into the reason for having the secret identity as to why he has it, or the fact that he keeps it secret because he also wants his friends to be, protected and all of that. It's just, I think here they're really just talking about the exposure of it, but he's clearly terrified. He's not just. I mean, actually, you could also argue that he could just fly out the window and fly around Metropolis with his X-ray vision and find the damn thing, but he can't because this is then, and also it makes for a better story. But no, he's clearly distressed. He does whether he doesn't want the rigmarole to be able to find another identity and give up that life or not. The point is he doesn't want to be exposed. So
Yeah, I think that's a fair reading, and there's a moment in particular where he really is forlorn over this, and he says to
mhm.
Candy, I forget the exact line, but something to the effect of "I've never felt like this in my life," and again, you see this weighing on him. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of a, I mean, in the context of this episode, but even more so, just this version, this iteration of the character and the larger legend. I do think it's a different flavor here than we would get in a modern era story where his identity is
Oh,
at risk
definitely.
because he's built so much more and the identity itself has so much more meaning and value. One of the things that I was thinking about here is, is Ma Kent still alive? Right? Because at the end of Superman on Earth, he leaves Smallville. She never appears on the show again. I'm not aware of any mention of her even. Um, this episode wasn't built for something like this. The show wasn't built for something like this. But this is an episode where I'm watching and it's like, oh man, what if, whether it was over the phone or he flew to Smallville, like there was a conversation. Like if ever there were an episode where it might make sense to have a conversation with Ma Kent, I feel
Yeah,
like this would be the one. So, it's something that's like, oh man, I wish there could have been something like that here. I get why there wasn't, but I couldn't help but think it as I was watching it.
sure, sure, makes sense.
All right, so I'm sure there are a few other odds and ends that we'll circle back to, but I guess the biggest question here, and I'll pose it to you first. I mean, what level of responsibility of guilt does Superman bear for the deaths of these two gangsters?
Okay. Well, it's interesting because I think part of this plays out into what did the jury hear and what was struck from the record. Because if you go and listen to the radio show version, it makes it very clear. It makes it crystal clear that Superman was being true to his word. Now, just to quickly remind our listeners, basically what happens is that Superman knows the jig is up. These people know that he's Clark Kent. He doesn't have super amnesia powers. He can't turn back the world. He can't do something. He can't kiss either one of them to make them forget. He has to. He's caught. And that's what makes this episode really good too. Is that he's caught. And how does he respond to that? Well, okay, his response is to commit a felony. His response to commit a felony is to kidnap these people. Okay, I don't think that there's any court in the land other than the fact that people who like Superman, but a jury should, based on the information in front of them, should convict him of at least kidnapping, because Superman really has no right to take these two people who who figured out his identity. He's not incarcerating them. He's not turning them over to the authorities. He's taking the law into his own hands, putting them at the top of a mountain, which the radio show says is 4,000 feet, and says, "Wait here. I'll be back. I'll help you out until I figure something out." Now, that in and of itself is a felony. Okay. Now, what happens next? They choose not to believe him, or at least Ace, choose not to believe him. Connie's like, no, I think we ought to believe him, and I don't want to, climb down in my high heels, And she's, and with I love it with their luggage, that's sitting there too. So of course Ace, who's the hard-headed one and has been difficult throughout all of this, says, no, 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 he's never coming back. He's leaving us here to die, and let's go. So they take it now. At this point, they take responsibility for their actions, in my view. Superman did say, don't do this. And they say, no, we're going to try to do this because think about it. If you are in their shoes, you might actually try that. And Superman probably should have known that, but nevertheless. So of course they try to climb, and what happens? it doesn't work out well. Is that they? I guess I think what happens is that he goes first, she goes second, she loses her footing because I think of the high heels or something like that, hits him, and they both tumble to their deaths. So, do I think it's murder? No. But do I think it's kidnapping in the first degree, which under New York penal law is when a death occurs as the result of a kidnapping? I would find Superman or Clark Kent, if you prefer, guilty of first degree kidnapping, and I'd put him in the slam.
There you have it. The prosecution rests.
That is it. That is the evidence suggests that they would not be dead if they had not been kidnapped, and therefore he is responsible for their deaths. But I think the proper charge should be first degree kidnapping, and for however many years that puts you in Sing Sing, with a special kryptonite bars or whatever, red sun lamp in your cell. But sorry, Superman, you didn't murder them, but you are responsible for their deaths. And in a civil case, when the families of Ace and Connie, when they bring the civil suit, then I think they'd have an even better case to collect what little money Clark Kent actually makes as a reporter. There you have it.
I thought I was supposed to be the lawyer here. Well, that was fantastic. I mean, honestly,
Well, I wanted to challenge your legal prowess to see what you were, So I figured I was going to put my entire case out there and let you stick holes in it.
no, but I mean, that's the thing. And we do have this felony murder rule where if someone dies in the commission of a felony. So honestly, I think in that context, I don't know that there are many holes to poke in it. I mean, it's interesting. And I know this has been discussed and debated and people have feelings about this. I think we're on the same page, right? That in the context of that instant, right, of him giving them that warning, don't leave, and they don't listen, right? They've now taken matters into their own hands. But we're right, in the larger context, he initiates all of this by bringing them there. I guess for me, yes, there's the legal aspect, but more the ethical side of this is, was he right in doing this? And it is an interesting question because it's like, what was he supposed to do with them?
Right.
What other
That's a
recourse
second.
did he have?
That's where the judge might come in and say he would either overturn the verdict or would set a very, 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 very low sentence, or might go by the minimum by law or whatever. And here's why: because Superman is responsible civilly and criminally for what happened in my mind because he kidnapped them and they died in the commission of that felony. Okay. Now, however, was it justified? Is it, to me, a different question? Are there extenuating circumstances? Is there a reason for this? And you could, and if you're Superman's defense lawyer, what I would argue is the greater good. Is that Superman was compelled to do something to protect the people of the planet Earth. That the greater role wasn't just for his own personal gain. He wasn't doing it to make money. He wasn't doing it to hide. You could argue that Superman felt a need to protect his identity so that he continued to do good works for humanity. And he could say, "Look, I told them. I had no choice. It was bad judgment on my part, but I didn't have it until I was able to figure out something. I had to keep them secluded because I could not afford to have my identity splashed all over the world and possibly end my uh, uh, um, end my effectiveness as a superhero. And therefore, for the good of mankind, I believe I should get special consideration." I think then another counter argument would be, then why do you need a secret identity? Why can't you just live somewhere as Superman? And really, what does it matter? But I think that you would be able to make a credible case that the it was justifiable what he did, especially because he made the point, although he's the only one who says he made, there's no witnesses, that he made the point for them not to move, stay safe. I will be back. In the radio show, he does come back. They actually show him coming back, and he's like, he's good to his word. I'm bringing back the food, or this, or that, or the other thing. And it's like, oh no, they didn't listen to me, the fools. They're dead. So that's my take on that part.
What's tough with the justification defense is typically there has to be some sort of right belief of an imminent physical harm, typically. And so here, what we're pointing to is sort of this larger, big picture argument. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that would carry the day. What's a few things that stand out. One is that
It depends on your lawyer, man. It
yeah,
depends. I mean, if you're getting a go for broke Johnny Cochran, I bet you he'd be able to pull this one off.
yeah, for sure. I mean, but
Yeah,
one of the things that's funny to me about this is in the scene at Ace and Connie's apartment, Ace is so quick to say, well, you're not going to kill us. We know Superman doesn't kill. Yet, in the
right,
very next scene, he refuses to believe that Superman will be true to his word and come back with the provisions he's promised
right,
them. So, but I
right.
suppose, in fairness, now, I guess, looking at it from Ace's perspective, the fact that Superman flew them to this
Hmm.
mountaintop is probably more than Ace ever expected him to do. So at this point,
Yeah.
it's like all bets are off. It's like, oh man, I think I misjudged this guy. Like he's not going to kill us, but he might just leave us here to starve.
Right, and also we don't know where he's going, but I'm presuming it's the Arctic. It could have been the Colorado Rockies or whatever, but I'm presuming it was the Arctic because they show the mountain ranges and it's all. So let's say he takes him to the Arctic, and that happens. Either way, whether it's snowy mountaintops or whatever, they could die of exposure very quickly. So at this point, he just might be panicking. And that's part of it. It's like, what do you mean he's going to build it? What are you talking about? He's not coming back. This is how he's going to get rid of us. And like you say, it's not that he's going to kill them. He's just not going to save them either. The old Batman line from Batman Begins. My theory is that even though we never see or hear of the Fortress of Solitude on the show, that Superman was only about 10 minutes away anyway. And he put them there for a reason. And he put them there because he knew he was near the Fortress of Solitude, could get them all the stuff that he needed, and was just going to be right back. And I don't think that he necessarily thought that these guys were going to be stupid enough not to believe him when he knew, look, I'll be back in 10 minutes. I'm Superman, for crying out loud. And so I think Superman in that regard would consider it a great tragedy, but would again feel justified. It's like, look, I was just going to the corner a fortress to get bedrolls and some firewood for these guys. I was helping. I think it would be kind of lame, for Superman to say that, but I'll allow
I never want to knock anyone's head canon, especially when it helps you make sense of something. But there's, in my mind, there's no version of of this
I mean, I
of
just
the.
made that up. It's not headcanon. It's just an idea.
But I feel like there's no way that George Reeves Clark, especially the season one Clark, has a Fortress of Solitude. I feel like he would, if you offered it to him, he'd be like, I have no time for this, and he'd fly away.
Yeah, right. Exactly. No, he just went back to whatever, I don't know, whatever trading outpost was nearby and was going to buy some blankets and what have you.
I what
And
I also what really made me laugh was in the confrontation in the apartment. Clark really genuinely seems to not know what he's going to do with them, but he's
yes,
very quick to say, pack a bag and dress warmly. So it's like he doesn't really seem to have a plan, but he knows they're going somewhere cold. Like that's instantly
yeah.
what he goes to. He's like, I don't know what I'm doing with these two, but it's gonna be cold. And and then like I wonder, this is again when I say like between the scenes, at what point on the flight does he come up with the plan? How I feel like he was probably flying them around for hours. He's like, oh, you know,
It's true. It's true. I don't know what I'm gonna. Am I gonna take him south or north? I don't know. North is more secluded. Pack a bag. Wear a coat.
you
Let's
know, like
go.
like here's the thing. If let's say earlier in the episode, it was either a headline in the Daily Planet when we were seeing those flashes, or maybe Clark was listening to the radio and there was just something about like, oh, this abandoned whatever, the people who own this cabin disappeared. Something that's like, oh, okay, he knows of a place that's not occupied and he's going to
Right.
take them there. but there's nothing to indicate that. I think he was really just winging it. So I would love to know what that flight was like, how long it took, and at what point he was like, okay, I'm going to put them here. 'Cause I really feel like
Probably
he just came out of nowhere.
And probably because they wouldn't shut up and were driving him crazy the entire trip. I mean, I think of at the end of Superman the movie where he comes flying into the prison, which I guess there was, no arraignment, but he flies him into prison with Otis and Lex, and he's got them and they're squabbling and everything, and I just imagine that the flight to the Arctic with these two was very similar with the bickering and look what you've gotten ourselves into, and Superman like that looks good. I got to drop these guys here because they're driving me crazy.
I'm actually surprised he didn't do uh, within the criminal justice system what he did with Candy, where he just brings them to a prison. He's like, you have to lock these two up, solitary confinement. They can't talk to anyone. Why? I can't tell you. And he just like leaves
Yeah,
them
right.
there. But yeah, it's oh, again, we've been talking about the radio show. So the title, as we have said, of that radio episode is Dead Men Tell No Tales. So we have to talk about this because for anyone, I'll just say this, for anyone who has not listened to the radio episode and you only know the stolen costume from the TV show, and if you feel, man, I can't believe Superman did that, that was so harsh, listen to the radio episode because the title of the episode comes from something he says to that version of Ace and Connie.
Yeah, I don't mind spoiling it because
Yeah, go for it.
it's a 60 or 70-year-old radio show and what have you, since the story is the same story, so it's just a point. But it does point out again the sense of not only just anxiety on Superman's part, but he threatens his life. He actually says to him, well, what's going to stop you from, what's going to stop us from telling what a blah, 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 blah. And Superman's response is that and he says it really like dead men tell no tales. I mean, he's menacing when he says it. And that's when Ace or whatever Moretti, I think is his name in the radio show, where he says, well, wait a minute. You're not going to kill us. You don't do that. And Superman's like, well, no, I don't, but I'm going to do something, and that's where we end up on the mountaintop. So they call his bluff and they sort of do that in the TV show. He says something like, hey, everyone knows you ain't going to harm us or nothing. But it's that much sharper on the radio show when he actually says dead men tell no tales because he's threatening his life. Another felony, by the way.
But it goes beyond on the radio show, the exchange, because this really jumped out at me when Moretti was like, you don't kill, that ain't your way. And Superman says,
Yeah.
I wish it were.
Yeah, right. That too. Yeah.
So again, I think what we got on the television show was actually a bit of a subdued
Sanitized.
version. Also, I don't want to forget that, not relevant to this particularly, but on the radio episode, it's one of the conversations between Clark and Candy when they're talking about the rope burglar being found dead, and now he's at the morgue. And if I remember this correctly, I think Clark is like, oh, he's at the morgue. Like, is he dead? And Candy just roasts him. He's like, no, he rented a bed for the night. I wish they kept that in the TV. That genuinely made me laugh.
He rented a bed for the night.
It's like, Clark, man, come on, got to keep up. That made me laugh though. That was funny. But yeah, so the radio episode was definitely a harsher version. But again, I think look, I think a couple of things. One, the character is being tested, right, in a way that he's typically not, and I think that's what makes for such a gripping story. And then also too, keeping in mind this was a different time and a more black and white, literally in the case of the television show, but a more of a black and white sense of justice. And so I understand for anyone who kind of has reservations about Superman's actions here. For my purposes, would we see this today? No, I don't think we would. But I think in this context, it made sense. I don't necessarily have, for this version of the character, I don't necessarily have such qualms about it. And what I appreciate, here's the thing. I mean, ultimately, Superman does get the out in that they fall to their deaths. He never has to worry about them again. But in other instances where someone finds out the secret, and the secret of Superman is a perfect example, that episode where the doctor does figure out that Clark is Superman and then is instantly killed in a gunfight with the police. In all these other instances, Superman never has to worry about it, right? Because he's given
Right.
this out by the episode. Here,
Right.
it's like the show forces him to make a choice, and whether it's the best choice or not, whether it's legally or ethically the right choice, in this context, I get it. It tracks, and it's kind of hard to fault him because, again, I don't know what else he really reasonably could have done. I mean, maybe if he had a Phantom Zone projector, but then that raises a ton of
But
other
that's a whole
ethical
other
questions.
ethical
Yeah.
question. Yeah, no, it's true. Um, we are talking about a different Superman. We're talking about what is basically a version of the Golden Age Superman, which was based more on the pulps, was more two-fisted, was more about vigilante justice and everything else that came with it. The development of as some people have referred to as Uncle Superman. Uh, it was a gradual shift, and you could see that even the difference between the radio show, which is much harsher, and the TV show, which for kids is toned down. And so you could see that sort of that evolution has been taking place. But the one thing I have not said is whether Superman is guilty or not of a crime. To your point, is he justified? And the bottom line, I got to give him, I got to give it to him. There's no way these two are going to shut up. There's no way that they're not going to tell anybody, unless he's able to find a way that nobody would ever believe them. And that to me is the is the difference. And he's Superman, and these are a couple of scumbags. And even though this isn't necessarily the appropriate course of action, he's Superman. Give him a break. He's got to figure out what to do. He's going to help him out, and they made stupid choices on their own. So yeah, he kidnapped him, but what wouldn't you do the same? So I would if I were the judge, I'd say pay a fine and community service, which entails you moving faster than a speeding bullet and leaping buildings in a single bound and continuing to save our lives every day in Metropolis, because his entire life is defined by community service. So there you go.
For
That
sure.
would be my that would be my disposition of the case.
Fair enough. Now, I guess playing devil's advocate for Ace and Connie here, they're actually, I think they're actually more reasonable than we maybe give them credit for. And one of the things that jumped out at me was when they're on the phone with Clark after the bombing, and they tell Clark to come to him, and Clark's like, "No, I'm expecting a lot of important calls tonight. You have to come here." And they're like, "Okay."
Yeah, I know, which is not good strategy, because you had to figure that no, come here where if they don't know any better, where a whole load of cops could be waiting.
Yeah, it was but they were just so
I mean,
accommodating
because it is
there.
extortion. I mean, it is. They're committing felonies left and right too. So
Yeah, I don't know. And then when they're at the mountaintop and Ace is pleading with Superman, it's like we won't tell, we swear. Again, look, you can easily argue he was just saying anything in that moment, but for whatever reason, I really believed him in that. Maybe because I knew his death was coming, but I don't know. But I was
yeah,
just like, I really feel like I'm like, you could trust this guy, and not
yeah.
that he really
No,
could, but in
no.
that moment. But again, I feel like
He
they did
might
it
have been
fairly
able to
reasonably.
trust Connie. I think he
Yeah,
might have been able to trust Connie, because she was more, even though she was more hardcore trying to find out, she also was more, she didn't want anybody getting hurt. She was more like, I'm not so sure about this part of it. I want to know and expose it, but I'm not sure about people being hurt by this. And so I think she would have been more, she would have been, I think Superman could have made a bargain with her. He would
prob-
get his friend Bruce Wayne to buy her an estate somewhere, pay her off, live like a queen somewhere, and never say anything again. Which also, of course, is not justice, but it's practical.
I have to say too, and again, I want to be mindful because I know people are kind of split on this, and for anyone who really is opposed to Clark's action in this, I understand. I don't agree, but I understand. If there's one thing that I do bump up against here, it's not so much the actions that he ultimately takes for the reasons we've talked about, but I think it's more that we don't see him wrestle with it at all. And again, this is the fan of the 90s and modern era of the character who he's always kind of grappling with what's right and what's wrong. I recognize that. And again, this version of the character is not built for that. But there's no, I think if there had been any sort of deliberation, his thing is more just like, where do I put you? Not so much, is it right for me to do this? And then I think even more than that, that final scene with Candy, I can understand why Clark is relieved. I get it. But I feel like it's a little bit too lackadaisical of an attitude towards the deaths of these people. And I think if there had just been a little bit more deliberation about whether or not it's right to remove these people from society totally on his own, and or if there had been any sort of, hey, I'm glad I don't have to worry about my secret, but it's kind of messed up that those two people fell to their deaths. You don't get either of that. And I think if there's one thing that I sort of bump up against in this episode, it's his approach rather than what he literally does.
Yeah, if it were in a modern comic, and rightly so, frankly, they would have had a scene that where it probably would have ended with him standing on the mountaintop saying, "What have I done? I couldn't do anything else, but what have I done?" And this is going to be something I'm going to have to carry with me, because even though I didn't do it, I put him in a position. And you'd have some lip service to that, and you'd have him standing on the on the mountaintop with little wisps of cold air coming out of his mouth, and looking. And here it's just like, well, hey, the case is over, huh, Kent? Sure is, Candy. And just everybody's happy at the end, and we've got two dead bad guys who pretty much had it coming, but maybe didn't.
Yeah, that's the thing. I've obviously seen this episode a bunch of times now, and I think that's sort of the thing that I always come back to. But like we've been saying, in this context of this show, this era, this version of the character, and this season of the show, it is in keeping. It doesn't necessarily feel out of place. And like, again, I don't want to belabor the point, but what I really enjoy about this episode, what I do think makes it so compelling, is that we are challenging the character in a different way. The stakes feel higher and more personal than they typically do. And the show, for the most part, doesn't give the typical outs that it normally does. And so it forces
Yeah,
him to make a decision, whether it's the right one or wrong one, but he has to make one. And it's different. So
yeah, yeah. Makes for a compelling discussion,
we
which
still
I
have
hope this
to,
just.
from hit my microphone there. From my perspective, it certainly was, and I hope the audience agrees. We still have to give our final rating of the episode, so we'll get to that. I had one last thing on my list here. Did you notice how poor the audio visual quality was
Yes,
relative to the other
yes,
episodes? Are
yes, it
you
is.
familiar with the backstory of this?
It wasn't it a lost episode, or wasn't there? Because I started looking into it. Wasn't hadn't it been missing or not shown on television? Fill me in, because I know that there was some history, and because you do look at it, and it is much it's much lower quality than the rest of the series.
For sure. So I didn't find a ton as I continue to research the show. If I learn of anything else, I'll be sure to share. But just from the IMDb trivia, it said that the print used for the DVD was a broadcast print, not a master print, because a master print was not available since that episode, to your point, had been out of circulation, uh, allegedly because of this whole debate over whether or not Superman caused these people's deaths. So that seemed to be why. But yeah, watching it, it definitely doesn't match the superior quality that we're seeing in the other episodes, even for such a show,
No,
for such an old show.
yeah, no, but I have to say that I actually kind of like it that way. I sort of like the muddiness and the griminess of watching it. I don't know why it feels right for this episode, but it makes it seem a little bit seedier, and so somehow that works. But yeah, I knew that there was something about it being a quote unquote lost episode, or that, I mean, that might be too broad a term, but I knew that there was a reason for that. So that's very helpful to know.
Similarly, the Honeymooners had all of those lost episodes, sketches from the Jackie
Right,
Gleason show, separate from the classic
right,
39 when it was its own show. And those, the quality on those is definitely rougher. Oh, I do
right.
actually one more hypothetical question, and then we'll do our rating, and I'll let you go. But you were talking about how he has to keep Candy in the dark, and I like the way it plays out. I'm not saying that I wished it had been different, because I think you get some good mileage out of that tension, and I think it shows a lot about Candy, that he's still willing to help despite all of
Mhm.
this. But I'm saying to myself, I feel like, and I'm thinking like what I would do if I were in Clark's position, and I feel like the mystery of what it could be, the fact that he's not sharing, I feel like that makes it worse. Like, could he have come up with something to tell him, or even even to say I'm holding a costume for Superman, right? Because we know that
Right.
there's this connection between the
Right.
Daily Planet and Superman. So it would not have been so beyond the realm of possibility if he's like, I'm able to contact him. He gave me a costume to hold. Again, it would have undermined the tension in the episode, but I feel like that would have
Oh,
worked.
definitely. Yeah, it would have worked at all, but like you say, it would have undermined the not only would have undermined the tension of the episode, it really would have undercut the way the whole episode plays out. It had to be, there as we've seen, there are a million contrivances in how Superman could protect his secret identity. Not too far off from what we would see, for example, in the color episodes when they were getting more and more like what Silver Age Superman was like. It wouldn't have been strange for a Superman robot to show up. You know what I'm saying? You could there were a million outs that they could have gone with, but they clearly wanted to do what if Superman's identity really was discovered by villains and what would happen? And that's what the story they wanted to tell, and they tell that story. And we see that Superman doesn't exactly acquit himself well. You can argue, the point, but it's definitely at the very least questionable, his solution to all of this.
Yes. But again, it gives us a lot to talk about. So, as you know, we rate the episodes on a scale of 1 to 5 fedoras. So, how many would you give the stolen costume?
I would give the stolen costume 4.5 jaunty fedoras. And the only half is because I do think that there's some lag in the middle. It starts off strong, it ends especially strong. I think there is a little bit too much back and forth between Candy and the villains. While it obviously is essential to the story, I think it slows it down a little bit. So I can't give it a full 5, but it's pretty damn close. It's definitely one of the best episodes they've ever done, no question.
Right on. No, I appreciate that analysis. I mean, rationally, I probably would give the same score, but I'm going to go with a full 5 for this for its place in the overall show and my
Sure.
enjoyment of it and the discussion that it led to and the questions it poses about what he should or shouldn't do. Even if I guess my final take on this is even if sort of the more ethical debate, deliberations aren't necessarily part of what's said in the episode, it's there and it allows us to talk about it and gives
Mhm.
us again a different component than we often see in these episodes. So I'm gonna give this will be I think I forget I feel like I've given a 5 before, but one of the few fives so far. So that'll be 5 from me.
Cool. I'll buy that argument.
Listen, this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this with me. Where would you like to direct folks with respect to 13th Dimension?
Come to 13th Dimension, 13thdimension.com. Come check us out. We have regular features you might like. One of my favorite features is our weekly retro hot picks, for example, where I pick a week well, the week is whatever week we're in, but I pick a year and say, okay, what were the comic books that were coming out that particular week? And I do it with my partner Scott Tipton, who does my regular hot picks with me. We do that on Mondays, so we do retro hot picks on Wednesday, and also introduce what was going on in politics, what was going on in movies, what was going on in music, and that's something that runs every Wednesday. And it's actually it's a real joy to put together, and readers really seem to respond to it. So that's just one example of something that you might find that you might like.
Very cool. And I think that's something that would likely appeal to this audience, right? Fans of this classic
Yeah,
television
yeah,
show. So thank you
definitely.
for sharing that. Thank you for taking part. Audience, thank you as always. I always appreciate it. Make sure you come back in 2 weeks for our next all new episode. Adventures await. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.